everything is better when we are side by side. Hey, side by side, side by side, side by side. Hey, side by side, when we are side by side.
Hey T, how's it going?
It's going, girl. It's going. No, it's good. It's good. Sun is shining. Summer's underway. All is good. All is good in the hood. How you doing?
I was going to say the same thing. There is something really beautiful about summer. And also, let's just keep it real like we always do. Exhausting about summer, at least for me, because I feel like I'm juggling way more in the summer with my kids and their schedules. And I straight up have signed up Jude, my oldest, for every VBS I can find in St. Augustine, Florida, because it's free childcare. I'm just being honest. But then I'm like, why did I do this to myself? Because then it's like a different location every day that I have to go figure out where to get my kids from. But I really do love being with my kids during the summer, but I'm definitely ready for them to go back once school time comes. So, yeah,
I'm so thankful I'm not even in that space yet. My kids are still in school all year round because they're in daycare and preschool. Yep. So I haven't had to figure out summer or, when kids get out at like 2:30 in the afternoon and you're like, look at your 5. Like, so thankfully I'm not in that space yet. Shout out to the daycare peeps.
Yeah. And shout out to all you parents out there that are dealing with schedules in the summer and working full time. I don't work full time, but my heart goes out to you. So, So we're talking about Z's episode. Zanelle was incredible. I'm so grateful for her and for her story and her honestly blessing us with sharing that with us, because I was really inspired by her willingness to see the purpose in the hardest parts of her story. And I'm really excited to talk about that with you today, T.
Yeah, same. I mean, if you listen to that episode or if you know me, you probably know Z, because she's one of my closest friends who I love so, so much. And I am so thankful that I get to walk with her and be included in parts of her story. And I'm even more thankful that she accepted the invitation to be on this podcast, because her story continues to inspire me in so many ways. And even as the details unfold, that woman is special, a special, special woman of God. And it's so apparent that God's hand is on her life. And I always joke with her that it's because her mom must be whispering in God's ear on her behalf. But I think the thing that inspires me the most about her story is what she said about when so much is taken from us. Yeah. God never leaves our hands empty. And it was that part in her story when she was reading the book of Job. And, I love how she's like, as a little kid, I'm just sitting there in the pews and I open up the Bible, and it's probably middle of the Bible, right? So she opens it up and she starts reading the book of Job, and her mom looks at her and goes, "What do you think about this?" And she goes, "Oh, but it's so sad." And her mom tells her to keep reading. And as she keeps reading and gets to the end, her mom says these 2 words that just, hit me so hard and were really convicting for me when we're going through her episode. And he said, "God replenishes." Like she said, God replenishes. I always joke that it reminds me of this like meme of the little girl that's holding like a teddy bear. And she's got this little scruffy kind of falling apart teddy bear. And Jesus kneeled before her with his hand open, asking her for her teddy bear. And she's like clenching it like, "Absolutely not, Jesus." And behind his back, he's holding this big, beautiful teddy bear, right? There are times when I think there's things in our hand that we want to hold on to, or we don't want to release to God, or we think he's taking from us, right? But he has something beautiful, and he never leaves our hands empty. And I just love, again, that line of like, God replenishes. But I think what was interesting for me too, especially when I think about the book of Job and a lot of what Zanelle talked about, her story's sad. Like, she lost her mom at 11 years old. I can't imagine leaving my kids. I can't imagine losing my mom, and the pain and the grief, and to see her incredible love for Jesus still persists. And we saw that even in the first episode of this season with John, and him losing his mom and then eventually losing his dad, and like the way he clung to Jesus even in the midst. And as she talks about that book of Job, he loses everything and he still yet clings to God. And I always question, like, man, what kind of faith do you have if in those hard parts, those parts where it would probably be so easy to be angry at God, you actually draw closer and you draw nearer? And I think it brings up this age-old question for me. Why do bad things happen to good people? And I talk to Miss Mary, I talk about her all the time, but my spiritual mentor on here. And, she always talks about these fixed mindset versus growth mindsets and positive intelligence, and like how to really become mentally resilient and strong. And one of the things that Miss Mary told me was this story, and I always reference the story, I always think about it, but she talks about this story about a man with a horse. He's a farmer and he has a good crop. And because of his horse, they're able to harvest like a really great crop. And his neighbors come up to him and go, "Man, you're so lucky. You're so blessed. Like, wow, you had the best harvest." And he goes, "Just wait and see. Just wait and see." Well, somebody hears about his horse and his harvest and steals his horse. And his neighbors come to him and go, "Oh man, that's so awful. I'm so sad. What are you going to do? How are you going to harvest another crop next year?" And he goes, "Just wait and see. Just wait and see." And then the person that stole his horse had 4 wild horses, or stored his horse with 4 wild horses. Well, they end up escaping, and his horse comes back to the farmer and brings the other 4 horses with him. And his neighbors come to him, "Oh my God, you're so lucky. Now you have 5 horses. Like, you'll have 5 times the crop." And he goes, "Just wait and see. Just wait and see." And then his son is like riding one of the wild horses, kind of trying to tame it or whatever. And the horse kicks his feet up and throws his son off. And his son breaks his spine and becomes paralyzed. And his neighbor goes, "Oh, what an awful, awful thing. I'm so, so sorry. I'm so sorry." And he goes, "Just wait and see." And then a war breaks out, and all the young men, all the sons, are sent off to war, and they all are killed. And his neighbors come to him like, "Oh, you're so lucky you still have your son," because mind you, his son's paralyzed and couldn't go to war. And he goes, "Just wait and see, just wait and see." Okay, you get the point of the story, right? But it's this idea of like, whether good or bad things happen to him, he never got too excited or too sad. It was always this just wait and see. He understood this concept that like good, bad, whatever it is, there will always be another season. There will always be something else that happens. There will always be something that will redeem this, or maybe even, a situation that could become harmful. Like, I don't want to just sit in one place, focused on one instance, but we live a lifetime. And so there will be good, or quote unquote, that will be deemed good, and there will be bad that happens to us, but just wait and see. And it just really led me to think about going back to Romans 8:28, and not to be cliche, because I know that this is a highly quoted scripture, but it just continues to make me meditate in a different way when she told me that story on Romans 8:28, which says, "All things," all keyword, "work for the good of those that love him, are called according to his purpose." And I think about that all the time, that all things, like God, nothing he created was bad. Remember, like everything was good, which means everything that is created can be used for God's good. And so I try to remind myself of that, even when situations happen in our lives that feel bad, right? We still serve a God that can make all things good. And so her story really like has sent me on that kind of train of thought and thinking about that.
TT, that is so good. And you've told me that story that Miss Mary told you before, and it's true. I think about all the moments in my life where God has simply asked me to just wait and see. Even honestly, just keeping it real like we always do. And I don't know why I even say that, because like I'm not going to tell the truth. But you and I were talking today, and there was this house that I was hoping for. And we've been in this process of getting this house for literally 6 months. And I have waited and waited and waited and waited. And there has been so many obstacles for this to happen. And yet we didn't get this house. I mean, we had an offer. We were under contract on this house. It was a house that we literally had a vision for hosting people in, doing house church in, it being a refuge and a place of peace for people. And yet I have to believe that God is saying, wait and see. It really tests my theology when what I think is going to be best for myself or for my family or for those around me, and then those things don't happen. It tests my theology when God's asking me to still wait and see and believe that what he has for us is going to be good. And that doesn't mean it's always guaranteed. It doesn't mean that we always get what we want, but it does mean that God will work it out for our good. And I hear that all the time. He works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But I think what we forget is sometimes it's not that those things are good. It's that God uses them for good. And I've heard a lot of times over my life, oh, well, God allows bad things to happen to us. And it must be because I did this, this, and this in my life. We feel like the bad things that happen are honestly a repercussion always of sin in our life. I mean, even think about the Gospels and when Jesus is talking to multiple different families, and anytime there was an ailment or leprosy or anything in scripture, what were the disciples asking? Oh, well, was it him or their parents that had sinned? It's always attached to something wrong that we have done in our life. But I think it's bad theology. And even look at Jesus and his response to those people every time. It's not them. It's not their parents. And yes, they've lived with this condition because of the brokenness in our world, because we are separated and separate ourselves, I would say, at times from God, and the repercussions and the brokenness that our world has given us is the reality of why really bad things and hard things happen. It's not that God says, well, you're a good person, I'm going to make something bad happen, or you're a sinful person, I'm going to make something bad happen. It's just the nature of our world. But it's not how Jesus responded to those people. And what did he do? He met them in their misery. He met them on the day. Think of the woman that was hemorrhaging, for all of those years. She thought she would never be healed. I'm sure even after Jesus healed her, she wishes she didn't have to walk through those 12 years plus of misery and of brokenness. But God still uses it for her good. And this isn't in scripture, but I'm going to go with it because I think it's true. I imagine that woman 12 years down the road, and she comes across another person that had the same condition. And now she is walking with that person, able to empathize with that person because she's been there and she's experienced it before. And I think God doesn't cause bad things in our life to happen, but God will use those things. And what the enemy meant for evil and for bad, God always means for good. He always means it for good. And he will take the worst things that could ever happen to us and he will turn them around for the good of other people. And so that's something I think about all the time, T, because honestly, even doing ministry with high school and middle school kids all these years, and even just in friendship with people, that's a question I hear all the time. Well, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And if God's so loving, then why do bad things happen? And I think if we flip the question, it's look how God takes what the enemy meant to destroy someone's life, and look how God still uses it for good, to change the lives of people around us.
Yeah, that's so good, E. That's so, so good. I love that you talk about how not only does God use it for good in our lives, but he uses it for the good in other people's lives as well. And I think about this often. you and I have talked about me losing a brother, and my
Yeah.
brother was shot and killed at 21 years old. And I remember just reflecting a lot on his life and how painful that was for me at the time, because it caused me to ask a lot of questions and do a lot of soul searching. And of course, I went through the gamut of why not me, and why am I still here? And also, how do I still keep him alive in so many ways? And
Yeah.
out of the pain that I felt from that situation, and the way that I processed, and the way that I grieved, and the way that I reflected on it, it birthed a lot of purpose in me. It took me on to go work in Chicago at the time, leading brand marketing for basketball specifically, and my core consumer were Black men 17 through 25. And honestly, the murder rates, especially by gun violence at that time in that city, were astronomical. They were more than New York and LA combined. And I remember when I was offered the job, it became so clear to me about what my purpose was. And I wanted to keep my brother and his legacy alive by using sport to save other kids' lives, because honestly, that was a big differentiator for me. And that was the thing that had helped me on my path, and helped me to get to the places I've gone, and helped me see the world, and open doors for me, and paid for college and all the things. And I was like, man, if that little basketball has the ability to save lives, because I know firsthand because it saved mine, then how can I use it to save other kids' lives, especially in this city, especially in this specific demographic? That's what drove my career a lot, right? It was by keeping the spirit of my brother alive, or hoping that I could do something for another kid that unfortunately I wasn't able to do for my brother. And
Wow.
as painful as it is, and as much as that is a hard part of my story, like, God used even that, you know?
Yeah.
And
He
so,
did. Yeah.
yeah,
TT, I love that you took some of the most immense pain that you've ever experienced in your life, and you used it as motivation and fuel to change the lives of people all around you, and specifically in the city of Chicago. So often when we walk through pain, or we walk through really hard things, it's really easy to just say, I'm done, and just to stay down, and to use that as honestly fuel to convince ourselves why even try. And yet you took something that was so hard and so painful, and honestly not the way it should be. Your brother should have never been killed. And yet you said, I'm going to honor him, and I'm going to honor the Lord, and I'm going to use this as fuel and ammunition to tell the enemy, you didn't freaking win, and you
yeah,
do not get the victory. And I can relate. I think of two specific things in my life that are to this day the most painful things I've ever walked through. One was losing babies. I lost 3 babies. One of them was way more late term than I ever imagined, and all 3 I grieved. But that last one that you and I walked through actually together, because we were doing supper club at that time, and I know you remember seeing that pain. And I wish that I never lost those babies. I never want to walk through that again. But when people lose babies, I'm the one they call. And it's not a badge of honor that I wear that I lost babies, but I am honored that I get to kick the enemy in the you know what by sitting with those people and not allowing them to lose hope, to speak hope back into their souls on their darkest day, which those days felt like my darkest day. I even think about my inspiration to go be a Young Life leader and then go on to be on Young Life staff. That was all fueled from my story that a couple episodes ago that you guys could go back and listen to. Like, my story is one of grief as a high school kid, and the depression and the eating disorder that I walked through. And I remember having this high paying, awesome job and leaving it all and forfeiting it all because I was like, I want high school girls. I want teenage girls, adolescent girls. I want them to know that there's hope for their life. I know the pressures that are on them, and I walked them so painfully. And I don't want them to feel alone because someone stepped into my story and I didn't feel alone. I wish that that's not a part of my story, but I use it as fuel for the good of others. And I think that's what we heard about in the last episode was Zanelle. Her mom should have never died. I'm mad that her mom's not alive. I wish I could have known her mom. One of my things that I am most angry about in this whole world is that I didn't get to know Judy, John's mom.
Yeah.
Like, I hate that. But man, do we live a different life inspired by her. And man, do I see her every day in my husband and the way he chooses to live his life with intention and purpose. It's easier said than done, but it's a real key thing to take our pain and to use it as fuel to change the world around us. But it's really hard to do.
Yeah, 1000%. And I think this is where, going back to that age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? I think we live under this misconception that life is supposed to just be smooth sailing. It's supposed to be a breeze. It's supposed to be without obstacles but honestly, there is no life on this earth that has not experienced suffering. Human suffering is a real thing. And honestly, I wouldn't even always say it's suffering, but hard things happen to us. That is just part of the human experience. We experience hard parts. And those hard parts serve as teachers if we allow them to. They serve as places of growth for us. They serve as places of revelation. They serve to weed out the bad stuff sometimes, and they serve to remind us of what we're made of and how we're wired and what we're built to do. And so I think part of our issue as humans is the fact that we think that this life should not come with hardships, or they will come. That is just the truest thing about life. I think we would be fooled to believe that we should live a life that was absent of hard.
Absolutely. But the key question is, what will we do with that hard? Like, what will we do with the hardship that we experience in our life? There's a John Ortberg clip that we can link below because I don't know the title of it. But I will say it was, he starts out the clip, he says, "What's your problem?" And he goes on to tell these stories of all these different heroes of the faith, like theologians and just people who've walked closely with God. And he talks about the hardship that they walk through and how that hardship reframed their purpose for their life. How that hardship that they've walked through in their life, instead of feeling like, man, God, I've done everything right, and so therefore you owe me this, they took on the hardship they experienced and they said, okay, this is what it really means to take up our cross daily and live for God. And this clip is a challenge. It was a really big challenge to myself and to John when we were watching it, and we shared it with our communion gathering group. It was a challenge to us because we sat down and we started writing out all the hardship that we feel like we're facing in our life, the things that are hard, big and small. It could be hardship in a marriage to, I'm really annoyed that my nails are broken. I mean, you understand what I'm trying to say is, like, we were listing out all those things, and then it was like, okay, and this is part of the human experience. Like, this is part of our life. And it's not just like, get over it. That's not what we're saying at all. And that's not what the clip was saying. But what the clip was saying is, okay, so obviously all of us in this room have something hard that we're walking through. No one is immune from walking through hard things in their life. That's not even possible. Even Jesus clearly lived the human experience. He went through plenty of hardship. I would argue probably more than any of us will ever experience in our lifetime. And yet, what did Jesus do with that hardship and how he used it to change the world around us? And you and I, T, earlier today, I love this girl. I love my sister, y'all. We always have these incredible conversations. And we were talking about C.S. Lewis earlier on our call before recording. And I was remembering a couple of different C.S. Lewis books that I've read, but one of them, there's this quote that talks about how we choose to be so distracted and we just live in this place of believing that the best for us is just in what we have. If we're dealt mud and we live in the slums, that we'll just spend the rest of our lives making mud pies out of it. And yet God always is offering us a holiday at the sea, like something greater for our life. And yet we miss it because we're so busy being pummeled by all the hard stuff. And we're focused so much on the hard stuff in our life that we forget about the good, that there's a lot of good. Even in our toughest days, there's a lot of good that God is doing and working in our life, and practicing gratitude is really, really important in the midst of that, because it shifts our focus back to what's really important. It clarifies our purpose and it shifts our thinking back to, God, what did you put me on this earth for? Because it surely wasn't for everything to go right. So how can I use even the suffering that I experience in my story to give me and fuel purpose in my life?
Yeah, I think about this quote from Mark in his episode earlier in this season, and he said, the very thing that has broken your heart the most in your life is often the very thing that becomes your purpose.
Yeah.
Right. And I think
That's
about
good.
that so deeply. I'm like, yes, those broken places are the ways that we identify the needs, because
Absolutely.
we aren't alone. Like, humans are going through some of the same things. There are other people that are walking through hard things similar to us. And I'm not saying the details of the situation are the same, but some of those core principles of grief, of heartbreak, of pain, of loss, of, isolation, of health issues. I mean, I can go on and on. Loss of a job, like financial scarcity and poverty. Like, there are hard things that we suffer on this earth that other people too are experiencing. And I just think about how those hard places often help us to identify a need where we could potentially help other people on the other side of us getting through it. Because I do believe that we get through it. I mean, I know you talked about Jesus, like, yes, girl, Jesus came to this earth to have a very human experience. And the very humans that he came to save are the very ones that killed him. Like, man, that sucks. But I also think about Paul. Girl, that definitely sucks. But I also think about Paul too. Paul was out here persecuting Christians. And
Yeah.
he then became one of the greatest authors of some of our favorite books in the Bible, trying to bring people to Christ. It was the
Right.
place that was the hardest, most painful, arguably the blemish in his life. That was the very thing that allowed him to know how to speak to people in those communities to draw them to the very Christ we serve. And
Yeah.
there's this beautiful passage that I think he was reminded of. I don't know if it's of his past or what his thorn was, but there's this beautiful passage in 2 Corinthians 12, and he's talking to God and asking God to remove this thorn. And, so many theologians have their own thoughts on what they believe that thorn was. I don't know what it is, and I'm not going to pretend to know. But what I know is, like, he's like, God, I've asked you to remove this 3 times, this thing that was causing him pain, that was making him suffer.
Yep.
And God responds to him. He notice he does not remove the
No.
thorn, but
Yeah.
he merely says that in our weaknesses, God's power is made perfect. That is sometimes where he does the best work in us. It is in
Yeah.
the places where we can't rely on our own strength. And I am going back to bad theology. I am not indicating that God makes us experience pain so he can use it for
Right.
his glory. They're not in in any way. By any means, I'm not trying to relate that, but I am reinforcing what you said earlier in this episode of he can take the painful parts, he can take the hard parts, he can take the parts that were meant to break us, he can take the parts that the enemy has tried to use against us, and he can redeem those things and he can make them so beautiful.
Yeah. Tutu,
Yeah.
that's a word, sis. That's so good. And
Yeah.
you bring it right back to the truth of scripture. And I mean, there's, like you said, there's countless examples of that between Paul, between Jesus, the disciples, even when Jesus was leaving the disciples in the Great Commission after he had reappeared to them. And he's like, hey, by the way, I'm going to send you to Samaria, which is the place that you're not welcome. Oh, and by the way, to the ends of the earth. Oh, and you're going to be crucified upside down, by the way. There was a lot of hardship that was being sent, and it didn't keep them from it. And I do think if we knew the hardest parts that were going to happen in our life, we'd probably not want to walk the journey. And yet we can walk through fire and still not be burned. In the end, we can still survive. And we're, that endurance that we gain through all the hard parts. But we have to remember that life is lived in seasons. And T, you and I joke like, oh gosh, sometimes this podcast, not sometimes, we feel like we just talk about a lot of heavy stuff in this podcast. And y'all, we want you to know the joy of the Lord is our strength. Yes, we're going to talk about the hard parts, but we also want to say we have a lot of fun. And life in Christ is really, really fun. We just know that the hardest parts of our story are the things that a lot of times we want to stuff and not talk about. And so that's why we go there and we talk about those things, but it's for a season. Like life isn't crappy all the time, or life isn't hard all the time. It's for a season. And sometimes those seasons last way longer than we want them to, but it's a season. And I will also say sometimes we fail to recognize that when we're walking through something really hard, maybe it's a sign that God's asking us to walk away from whatever we are putting our hand to the plow in. Even I've talked about my story before, and you've talked about your story with Nike and mine with Young Life. Like I can say for my story, I stayed longer than I was supposed to. And that was a long season of walking through hardship that was unnecessary. And so that's just a thought and a word I feel like that came to my mind that I didn't even plan on saying is sometimes even in that hardship that we're walking through, it can be self-inflicted hardship. And all we have to do is honestly pause and think, God, this is really hard right now. And maybe you're asking me to take a break. Maybe you're asking me to walk away, or maybe you're asking me to endure. And I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves.
That's good, Ian. I love that you talked about seasons because I think that's super important to acknowledge. One, we can walk through hard seasons. Yeah. And yet there's still joy available to us. There are still things that are happening around us that we can focus our energy on. But I do know that there are some of those seasons where it's like there's more dark than good right now. And it feels heavy and it hurts. And I love that you talked about seasons because seasons don't last forever. Even going back to the word, like it says, like, sorrow and weeping may come in the night, but joy comes in the morning. That's even indicative of the fact that like those hard seasons will not last forever. Maybe our morning takes a little longer, right? Like daylight savings or something, and there's more dark than light in the day, but joy is promised to us on the other side of it, or that we won't be in that season forever. And I think a lot about this. I had a conversation with a mentor of mine a couple months ago, and I was specifically talking to her about stepping back from our career because we took a season of rest and, stepping back from our career. And I remember when I felt like God was calling me to that, and I sought her counsel on it. And then she was about to step back into her career. And I remember asking her, like, are you ready? And we were talking about all of the things that come along with that. And I remember her saying, like, I chose to step away because I felt like that was what I was supposed to do at that time. But here's the thing I know to be true. I am now stepping back in and I'm more equipped. I'm more prepared. I'm more confident than I've ever been before. And I think that I needed that time away. But life is lived in seasons. And that's exactly what she said to me. She said, look, I didn't stay in that season of stepping away or prioritizing family or anything forever. We are constantly in motion. We are constantly in progress. Even when she was in a season that didn't look like she was preparing to advance in her career, she was being prepared. And it makes me think about even like actual seasons when you think about it, right? You plant in the spring and then you go into summer and you bear fruit.
Yeah.
And then the fall comes and stuff starts to wither. And then winter comes and there's nothing on the plant.
Yeah.
And then spring comes again. And oh, what? You start to see buds. And I think what that tells me is like, even in the falls, even in the winters, just because there's an absence of the proof of the fruit does not mean that it will not resurface and it will not sprout again. And I remember walking a couple years ago, I do my little God walks, and there are these beautiful trees that turn the most brightest color of red in Oregon. And I remember looking at it and God was like, look at that tree and look how beautiful it is. And in a couple of weeks, all of its beauty and splendor will disappear, but it will return. And I was sitting in my quiet time just yesterday, thinking about like this episode that we were going to have. And ironically, I played Russian roulette with my Bible and I just opened it up and whatever page it was. And it opened up to Psalm 1. And this scripture stood out to me in Psalm 1. It's in Psalm 1, verses 2-3. And it said, instead, his delight is in the Lord's instructions and he meditates on it day and night. And this is what stood out to me. He is like a tree planted beside flowing streams that bears its fruit in its season. And its leaf does not wither, whatever he does prosper. But it was that line, that bears fruit in its season. He's talking about this tree planted near a water source, a stream that will not go dry. Like it has the sun and water and soil and fertile. He's talking about how much this tree is in an environment where it should thrive and it should produce fruit. But then it says it bears fruit in its season, indicating that there are seasons where we will bear much fruit. And there are also seasons where we won't bear any. And what I love was that next line. But even in the seasons where we won't bear any fruit, it says its leaves do not wither. We don't die. We don't die in the seasons where we're not bearing fruit. But sometimes the seasons where we're not bearing fruit are actually preparations for the seasons where we will.
That's good.
And so, yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah, E, I'm going to get off my soapbox now.
I love it. No, I love it. And it reminds me of my banana tree in my backyard because, you know, I'm living in this tropical land, aka humidity central of Florida. So it's about the only thing that can grow and not wither and die. And the first year that we moved to Florida, the banana tree that we had, it was small and it was growing. And then the first summer it had a few bananas and that was great. And then I remember the next summer, you know, and it goes through the winter and goes through the pruning process and all that. And with a banana tree, and y'all, I'm not a horticulturist, whatever, however you say that word. But what I did learn about banana trees is that you have to chop them down almost all the way down to prune them back. And and I'm thinking they killed it. Well, that next summer when it regrew, it didn't have any bananas. And I remember being like, what in the freaking world? That guy messed up my banana tree. And then they did the same thing that next winter. And I remember just being so mad. But last summer, that banana tree had so much fruit. So much fruit. And so it is with our life, T. How many times have we sat back and seen just what feels like just ultimate pruning in our life, where we're like, God, where in the world are you? I do not see you right now. and we're preparing and we're doing all the right things, and we're soaking into God, and then devastation happens or something happens and we feel like, God, where are you? And then we do all the prep and still we feel like we're seeing no fruit. And then, just like taking it back to the beginning of the episode, if we wait and see, God replenishes and he brings even more than we could ever imagine. And I'm just thinking about all the people in my life right now, T. And this might be you who's listening right now that are walking through something right now that feels like it is going to take you out. And you're like, God, I have been faithful. I've been walking with you. I've been preparing for this. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's, I don't know what it is for you, but you're like, God, I've been preparing and I'm not seeing any fruit. And I will tell you, just wait and see, because he does replenish. He does rebuild. Stay planted. Stay by the water. I mean, as cliche as that sounds, it's scripture and it's true. Like, remember what your source is, and remember and believe that season of waiting, even in our own lives, that season of waiting, even that you and I experience, TT, is why we get to do communion. It's why this podcast is going so well. It's why we get to turn on a mic and make other people not feel so alone in their journey. That's our prayer. That's our hope. That's why we do this. Trust me, y'all, we're not making any money from it, nor is that our hope and that's not what we're in this for. We felt like God gave us a vision to inspire and to make people not feel so alone in this walk with Jesus. And it was all because we chose to stick with it, even when we didn't see the fruit.
Yep. 1,000%. 1,000%. So we leave you with that, right? Wait and see.
Wait and see.
Because God replenishes.
Yeah, he always does. Yeah.
So good, sis. So good. Well, until the next time, please go follow us on Instagram at Come.Union. Listen to us on Apple, Spotify, or any of your other platforms. You can also watch it on YouTube. And leave us a review.
We have a website. But I don't think anyone probably checks it out. So if you ever want to check it out, you can check out our website too at Come.Union.com. So
there we go. And we look forward to turning on this mic again and talking to all of you very soon. So thank you for listening. Hope you are encouraged by this episode. We love you guys so much. And on that note, let the reconciliation begin.
Thanks so much for listening today. Want to stay up to date with our episodes? Then subscribe to our podcast and newsletter on our website, Come.Union.com. Follow us on Instagram at Come.Union. Rather watch our podcast? Then subscribe to our YouTube channel at Come_Union. We are so glad you're a part of this community.